The grand ballroom of the Naval War College gleamed under crystal chandeliers, their light dancing across 200 officers in pristine dress whites. I paused at the entrance, allowing myself one breath to take it all in. 24 years of service had led to this moment, to this room in Newport, Rhode Island, where the most distinguished naval officers in the Pacific Fleet had gathered. And somewhere near the back, seated at a table they had no business occupying, was my family. I adjusted my medals one final time. Each ribbon told a story. Each decoration represented nights I had spent far from home, decisions that weighed lives in the balance, missions that would never make the newspapers. Tonight, I would add one more to the collection. Tonight, the Distinguished Service Medal would join the others, and a single star would replace the eagle on my collar. But my family didn't know any of that. I spotted them immediately. Victoria sat ramrod straight in her designer gown, scanning the room for anyone worth knowing. My father hunched beside her, nursing a whiskey and looking thoroughly uncomfortable among so many uniforms. Derek leaned back in his chair with that smug expression I remembered from every holiday dinner I had missed and every family gathering I had not been invited to attend. Melissa whispered something to her husband, and they both laughed while glancing in my direction. I walked toward them, steady, measured. The way I had walked across the deck of my destroyer during a typhoon, the way I had walked into briefing rooms where admirals twice my age waited for my assessment. Victoria saw me first. Her eyes traveled from my face to my uniform to the rows of ribbons on my chest, and her lip curled into something between disgust and disbelief. "You actually wore that," she hissed as I approached the table. "Among real officers." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that Victoria's questions were never really questions. Derek snorted loudly enough for the neighboring table to hear. "Did you borrow someone's costume for the night? Because there's no way the Navy gave you all those ribbons." He pulled out his phone, angling it toward me. "This is going in the group chat. Everyone needs to see this." My father looked up briefly, then away. He would not meet my eyes. He never could. "Sarah," he muttered toward his drink, "you know how Victoria gets. Just keep a low profile tonight, okay?" I felt the familiar sting of his dismissal, that casual cruelty disguised as peacekeeping. 42 years old, and some part of me still ached for him to see me, to truly see me. Melissa leaned toward her husband, her whisper carrying farther than she intended. "Can you believe they let her in? The Navy must have some kind of charity quota. Invite the failures so they feel included." Her husband nodded along, ever the loyal accessory. I remained standing, my posture parade ground perfect. Across the room, Admiral Brennan caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Beside me, I sensed movement. Uncle Frank, my father's older brother, the only one who had ever treated me with genuine respect. He had served 20 years as a chief petty officer before retiring, and something in his expression told me he suspected more than he let on. He offered me a small nod of solidarity, a lifeline in hostile waters. Then Victoria struck. Her hand shot out and grabbed my arm, manicured nails digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. She yanked me down toward her, her perfume cloying, her breath hot against my ear. "Fake a headache," she hissed. "Fake food poisoning. I don't care what excuse you use. Just get out before anyone important notices you're here. You're embarrassing this family by existing in this room." I looked at her fingers wrapped around my arm, red nails against navy blue fabric. I thought about the 3,000 civilians I had helped evacuate from a war zone. I thought about the sailors who trusted me with their lives. I thought about every letter I had sent home that went unanswered, every promotion announcement that disappeared into silence. She spent 15 years hiding my letters. She couldn't hide who I became. I reached down and calmly removed her hand from my arm, finger by finger. I did not yank. I did not struggle. I simply reclaimed what was mine with the quiet authority of someone who had commanded warships through contested waters. Victoria's eyes widened. No one had ever refused her before, not like this. "Don't you dare embarrass us by staying," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. I straightened my uniform. I checked my watch. 8 minutes until the ceremony began. "Actually, I said, my voice steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Then I turned and walked toward the front of the ballroom, toward the reserved seating near the stage, leaving Victoria sputtering behind me. As I walked toward the front of that ballroom, each step carrying me further from my family's table, I felt the weight of 24 years pressing against my chest. Not the weight of regret, the weight of remembering, because Victoria's cruelty tonight was nothing new. It was simply the latest chapter in a story that began when I was 18 years old and my mother took her last breath. Cancer had stolen her slowly, piece by piece, over the course of 2 agonizing years. I had been there at the end, holding her hand in that hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers. My father had been there too, but he was already somewhere else, already retreating into the shell of a man who couldn't bear to feel anything at all. My mother had looked at me with those tired eyes that still held so much love despite everything the disease had taken, and she had whispered words I would carry with me onto every ship, into every storm, through every dark night at sea. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Don't let anyone make you small." 6 months later, my father married Victoria. I remember standing in my childhood bedroom, still filled with my mother's touches, the curtains she had picked out, the bookshelves she had painted herself, watching my father exchange vows with a woman who looked at me like I was an obstacle to be removed. Victoria had 2 children from a previous marriage. Derek was 11 then, already spoiled and mean in the way that children become when they learn early that money can buy forgiveness. Melissa was 9, a miniature version of her mother, all performance and no substance. From the very first day, Victoria made her intentions clear. This was her house now, her family. I was merely an inconvenient reminder of the woman who had come before. At 19, I made my decision. I walked into the Navy recruiting office in downtown Boston while my father was at work and Victoria was at her tennis club. When I came home that evening and announced that I had enlisted, my father's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, cold disapproval. "Mitchells don't serve," he said, setting down his newspaper with careful precision. "We employ those who serve." Victoria smiled from the doorway. It was the first time she had ever looked at me with anything resembling satisfaction. She saw my enlistment for what it truly meant to her. I was removing myself from the equation. I left for boot camp 3 weeks later. My father did not drive me to the airport. He did not hug me goodbye. He handed me an envelope containing a check for $500 and told me to call if I came to my senses. I never cashed that check. I still have it somewhere, tucked in a box with other relics of a life I left behind. Boot camp was hard. It was supposed to be hard. But I discovered something about myself in those grueling weeks of physical training and mental conditioning. I discovered that I was exactly as strong as my mother had promised. Stronger, even. I excelled in ways that surprised my instructors and stunned myself. By the end of basic training, I had been recommended for officer candidate school. I wrote my father a letter. I told him about OCS, about my plans to become a commissioned officer, about how I had found purpose and direction for the first time since losing Mom. I asked if he was proud of me. I asked if he might come to my graduation. He never responded. What I didn't know then was that Victoria had intercepted that letter. She read it, laughed about it with Derek, and threw it in the trash. This became her pattern. Every letter I sent home, every photograph, every announcement of a promotion or commendation, she plucked from the mailbox before my father could see it. And when family members asked about me, Victoria had her answer ready. "Sarah washed out, I'm afraid. She's doing some kind of clerical work on a supply ship somewhere. Answers phones, I think. She sends letters begging for money, but Richard refuses to enable her failures." I learned about this lie years later, from a cousin who let it slip at a funeral. By then, I had already commanded a destroyer. By then, I had already saved lives during humanitarian operations that made international news. By then, I had stopped expecting anything from my family at all. But in those early years, the silence had nearly broken me. I remember sitting in my quarters as a young lieutenant, fresh off my first deployment, staring at the phone and wondering why no one ever called. I had sent postcards from every port. I had mailed photographs of myself in uniform, standing on the deck of my ship with the ocean stretching endlessly behind me. I had written to my father on his birthday, on Christmas, on the anniversary of my mother's death. Nothing. Year after year, nothing but silence. When I was 27, I received a promotion to lieutenant commander. It was a significant achievement, especially for someone my age. I was one of the youngest officers in my fleet to reach that rank. I sent my father a formal photograph, taken in my dress whites with my new insignia gleaming. I included a letter explaining what the promotion meant, how it positioned me for command, how I wished he could see what I had built from nothing. Victoria threw that photograph away too. At extended family gatherings I was not invited to attend, she showed everyone a different picture. A woman who had squandered every opportunity. A cautionary tale told to Derek and Melissa, a warning about what happened when children disappointed their parents. They grew up believing I was a failure, a joke, someone to pity and mock. They were raised on Victoria's lies like mother's milk, and they swallowed every drop. My father's 60th birthday came and went without a word to me. I learned about the party from Uncle Frank, who called me on my ship in the middle of the Pacific to apologize for the family's behavior. He told me about the toasts, the speeches, the way Derek had stood up and called Richard the best father anyone could ask for. He told me that my name had not been mentioned once. I thanked him for telling me. Then I ended the call and stood on the deck of my destroyer, watching the sun sink into the ocean, and I made a decision. I would stop trying. Not stop succeeding. Not stop achieving. Not stop building the career that had become my identity, my purpose, my reason for waking up each morning. I would simply stop trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I was worthless. I would invest my energy in the family I had chosen, the sailors who served under my command, the officers who respected my judgment, the Navy that had given me everything my blood relatives had denied. The pain didn't disappear. It transformed. It calcified into something hard and cold that I carried in my chest like ballast, keeping me steady when the seas grew rough. At 38, I made captain. I commanded a destroyer in Naval Strike Group 7. I led missions that saved thousands of lives during a crisis in the South Pacific. I published strategic papers that were cited by professors at this very Naval War College where I now stood. Admiral Brennan himself had handpicked me for the accelerated command track, telling me I represented the future of naval leadership. Through it all, my family believed I answered phones on a forgotten ship somewhere. Victoria's lies had created a reality so complete that my father never questioned it. Why would he? It was easier to believe his daughter was a failure than to confront the wife who had isolated him from the truth. It was easier to shake his head in disappointment than to pick up a phone and ask me directly how I was doing. He chose comfort over curiosity. He chose Victoria over me, and eventually I accepted that those choices were permanent. But tonight, standing in this ballroom surrounded by the officers who knew exactly who I was and what I had accomplished, I realized something had shifted inside me. Victoria's hand on my arm had crossed a line. Her demand that I leave, whispered in front of my peers, had cracked something open that I thought I had sealed away forever. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter than rage, something more dangerous. Clarity. I understood now that I had nothing left to prove to them. But I also understood that in 8 minutes, they would learn the truth whether I wanted them to or not. The ceremony would proceed. My name would be called, and 15 years of carefully constructed lies would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Part of me wanted to warn them. That part was 18 years old and still mourning her mother, still hoping her father might one day see her for who she really was. But the rest of me, the officer who had commanded ships through storms and led sailors through danger, that part of me felt something else entirely. Anticipation. I found my seat in the front row, the one with the small placard bearing my name, RADM Sarah E. Mitchell. The abbreviation still felt new, still carried a weight I was learning to bear. Around me, other senior officers settled into their places. Captain Harrison from Naval Station Norfolk nodded respectfully as he passed. Commander Diaz, who had served as my executive officer 3 years ago, caught my eye and smiled with undisguised pride. These were my people. This was my family. Behind me, I could feel Victoria's gaze burning into the back of my head. I didn't need to turn around to know she was confused. Why had I walked to the front? Why was I sitting among the flag officers? Why had no one stopped me? The questions would answer themselves soon enough. I closed my eyes for a moment and focused on my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The same technique I used before every critical operation, every high-stakes briefing, every moment when the weight of command threatened to crush me. My heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit, not from fear, from something more complicated. For 15 years, I had built walls around the part of me that still craved my father's approval. I had buried that wounded girl beneath layers of discipline and duty and purpose. I had convinced myself that his opinion no longer mattered, that Victoria's cruelty couldn't touch me anymore, that I had evolved beyond needing anything from people who had given me nothing. But sitting here, knowing what was about to happen, I felt those walls beginning to crack. The truth was that Victoria's physical grab had done something unexpected. It had awakened the 18-year-old who had stood at her mother's grave and sworn to make something of herself. It had stirred the young ensign who had cried alone in her quarters after another unanswered letter. It had reminded me that beneath the medals and the rank and the carefully cultivated composure, there was still a daughter who had never stopped wondering why she wasn't enough. I opened my eyes and stared at the empty podium. Tonight wasn't about revenge. I had never wanted revenge. Revenge implied that I had been sitting in darkness, plotting their downfall, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That wasn't who I was. That wasn't what the Navy had made me. But justice, recognition, the simple, undeniable truth laid bare for everyone to see. Yes, I wanted that. I had earned that. Victoria's whispered command echoed in my mind. Get out before anyone important notices you're here. The irony was almost too perfect. In approximately 6 minutes, every important person in this room would not only notice me, but would rise to their feet in my honor. The woman who had spent 15 years erasing my existence was about to watch the entire Pacific Fleet acknowledge it. I thought about Derek's photo, the one he had threatened to share with his group chat. I wondered how he would caption it now. My loser stepsister pretending to be someone. Or perhaps, the moment I realized I'm the actual failure in this family. A small, petty part of me hoped he hadn't deleted it yet. I thought about Melissa's cruel whisper about charity cases. I thought about my father's averted eyes, his mumbled request that I keep a low profile. I thought about every Thanksgiving I had spent on a ship because there was no place for me at the family table. Every Christmas morning I had woken up in officers' quarters, surrounded by sailors who were also far from home, united in our chosen sacrifice. The Navy had become my family, because my family had refused to be one. But here was the thing about chosen families. They didn't replace the wound of rejection. They simply helped you survive it. The ache was still there, buried deep, surfacing at unexpected moments, like now. I straightened in my seat and forced my thoughts into order. This was not the time for sentiment. This was a ceremony, a formal recognition of service and achievement. I had a speech to deliver, a promotion to accept, a new chapter to begin. Whatever happened with my family tonight was secondary to that. The room was filling now, more officers taking their seats, more civilians finding their tables. I could hear the general murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the soft background music that would soon fade to silence. The stage was set. The players were in position. I turned slightly, just enough to glimpse my family's table in my peripheral vision. Victoria was leaning toward my father, speaking rapidly, her hands gesturing with barely contained agitation. My father looked confused, his brow furrowed, his mouth slightly open. Derek had his phone in his hand, scrolling frantically, his smug expression replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Melissa was showing something to her husband, who had gone very pale. They were beginning to suspect. The evening's program had been distributed earlier. Every table had a copy. The cover featured the Naval War College seal and the words Distinguished Service Medal Ceremony in elegant gold lettering. Inside, on page 3, was the biography of tonight's honoree. My biography. My photograph in dress whites, my list of commands, my decorations, my achievements. Victoria had received a program, but knowing Victoria, she had dismissed it without reading, just as she had dismissed every piece of mail bearing my name for the past 15 years. Old habits die hard. Uncle Frank, however, had opened his program. I could see him now, holding it in both hands, reading carefully. As I watched, a slow smile spread across his weathered face. He looked up, found me in the front row, and our eyes met. He raised one hand in a subtle salute, his eyes glistening. At least one person at that table had always believed in me. The lights flickered once, twice, the signal that the ceremony would begin shortly. Around me, officers finished their conversations and turned their attention toward the stage. The room grew quieter. I reached beneath my uniform and touched the locket I wore against my skin. My mother's locket, the one she had given me the day I left for boot camp. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of us, taken when I was 7 years old, both of us laughing at something my father had said. Back when we were still a family. Back when love was simple. "We're almost there, Mom," I whispered. The lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the podium. Admiral Brennan emerged from the wings, resplendent in his dress whites, his chest heavy with decorations earned across 4 decades of service. I stood with the other officers as he approached. 200 people rose to their feet in respect. At the back of the room, I heard Victoria's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Why is everyone standing? What's happening?" No one answered her. The ceremony was about to begin. Admiral Brennan reached the podium and surveyed the room with the calm authority of a man who had commanded fleets across every ocean on Earth. His presence alone was enough to silence any remaining whispers. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the ballroom without effort. "Please be seated." 200 chairs shifted in unison. I lowered myself back into my seat, my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. The posture of discipline. The posture of a woman who had learned to wait. "Distinguished guests, fellow officers, honored civilians," Admiral Brennan began. "Welcome to the Naval War College. Tonight, we gather to recognize extraordinary service to our nation and to our Navy. Tonight, we honor one of our own." I felt a flutter in my chest. Not nerves exactly. Anticipation sharpened to a fine edge. Before we proceed with the formal ceremony, I want to take a moment to speak about leadership. Not the leadership taught in textbooks or lecture halls, but the leadership forged in the crucible of real command. The kind of leadership that emerges when lives hang in the balance and there is no time for second guessing. He paused, letting his words settle over the audience. In my 42 years of service, I have met perhaps a handful of officers who possess that rare combination of tactical brilliance, moral courage, and genuine compassion for those under their command. Officers who inspire not through rank or authority, but through the quiet example of their own conduct. Tonight's honoree is such an officer. From somewhere behind me, I heard a phone buzz, then another, and another. The Navy's press release had gone out. I didn't turn around, but I could imagine the scene at my family's table. Derek scrolling through his notifications, his face draining of color. Melissa grabbing her husband's arm, showing him something on her screen. Victoria demanding to know what was happening, why everyone was looking at their phones, why the mood had suddenly shifted. My father sitting in confused silence, understanding nothing. Admiral Brennan continued his introduction, his voice warm with genuine admiration as he outlined the career of an officer he clearly respected. He spoke of 3 deployments in contested waters. He described the humanitarian mission in the South Pacific, the evacuation of civilians from a coastal city ravaged by flooding and civil unrest. He mentioned the strategic papers I had published, the innovations I had brought to fleet operations, the sailors who had written letters praising my leadership. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this officer, he said, is not what appears in the official record. It is what I have witnessed personally over 12 years of service together. A leader who never forgot the junior enlisted. A commander who knew the names of every sailor on her ship, their families, their struggles, their dreams. A woman who gave everything to the Navy because the Navy gave her a home when she needed one most. I blinked rapidly, fighting the unexpected sting of tears. He knew. Admiral Brennan had never asked directly about my family, but he knew. He had seen me spend holidays on base when other officers went home. He had noticed that no one ever came to my promotion ceremonies. He had observed the absence in my life and had quietly, respectfully, never drawn attention to it. Until now. Now he was drawing attention to all of it. Not the absence, but the fullness. The family I had built in its place. Behind me, the disturbance at my family's table was growing. I could hear Victoria's voice, pitched low but urgent, hissing something at my father. I heard Derek say, "This can't be right," loud enough for neighboring tables to glance in their direction. I heard the scrape of a chair as someone stood, then sat back down. A young lieutenant commander seated 2 rows behind me leaned forward and whispered to the officer beside him. "Is that the family? The one from the file?" I didn't know what file he meant. I didn't want to know. Admiral Brennan was wrapping up his introduction now. "This evening, it is my profound honor to present the Distinguished Service Medal to an officer whose career exemplifies the finest traditions of the United States Navy. An officer who, tonight, will be advanced to the rank of Rear Admiral." A murmur rippled through the civilian guests. The officers remained silent, but I could feel their attention sharpen, their pride building. Her name will be familiar to many of you who have served in the Pacific Fleet. For those who do not yet know her, I invite you to listen to her words tonight, because she represents the future of naval leadership. He turned toward me. 200 heads followed his gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Commander Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell." The word commander hung in the air for a fraction of a second. My current rank, my rank for only a few more minutes. I rose from my seat. The officers around me rose with me. Then, like a wave rolling through the ballroom, the entire room stood. 200 people on their feet, applause building from polite acknowledgement to something deeper, warmer, more sustained. I began walking toward the podium. The distance was perhaps 30 feet, but it felt like 30 miles. I was aware of every step, every breath, every heartbeat. I was aware of the eyes on me from every direction. I was aware of my family's table in my peripheral vision, a tableau of shock and confusion. Victoria had gone absolutely still. Her champagne glass was frozen halfway to her lips, the golden liquid catching the light. Her face had lost all color, her carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. My father's mouth hung open. Literally open, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with something I couldn't identify. Disbelief, confusion, the dawning horror of realization. Derek was fumbling with his phone, nearly dropping it twice. His earlier photo of the loser stepsister in her borrowed medals was about to become the most embarrassing mistake of his life. Melissa had stopped whispering. She gripped her husband's arm so tightly that he winced, but neither of them could look away from me. And Uncle Frank, dear Uncle Frank, who had spent 20 years as a chief petty officer and understood exactly what was happening. He was on his feet before anyone else at the table, his weathered face streaming with tears, his hand raised in a salute that trembled with emotion. I reached the podium. Admiral Brennan extended his hand, and I shook it firmly. "Congratulations, Sarah," he said quietly for my ears only. "You've earned this, every bit of it." "Thank you, Admiral." He stepped aside, and I turned to face the room. The applause continued, a wall of sound that pressed against me from all sides. I saw faces I recognized. Officers who had served under my command, their expressions glowing with pride. Instructors from the War College who had debated my strategic papers. Junior officers who looked at me like I was proof that their own ambitions were possible. And at the back of the room, my family, frozen in their seats while everyone around them stood. Victoria's champagne glass had finally slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. No one even noticed. She spent 15 years hiding my letters. She couldn't hide who I became. Admiral Brennan returned to the podium with a velvet box containing the Distinguished Service Medal. He opened it, revealing the medal's bronze and enamel face, the ribbon of red, white, and blue. For exceptionally meritorious service in a duty of great responsibility, he read from the citation. Commander Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell demonstrated extraordinary leadership during humanitarian operations in the South Pacific, coordinating the evacuation of more than 3,000 civilians under hazardous conditions. Her actions directly resulted in the preservation of countless lives and brought great credit upon herself and the United States Navy. He pinned the medal to my uniform, just above the ribbons I had earned over 24 years of service. The weight of it was slight, but the significance was immense. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. By order of the Secretary of the Navy and the President of the United States, Admiral Brennan announced, Commander Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell is hereby advanced to the rank of Rear Admiral, United States Navy. An aide approached with a small box containing my new insignia, the single silver star that would replace the eagle on my collar, the star I had worked my entire adult life to earn. Admiral Brennan removed my commander's insignia with practiced hands and replaced it with the star of a Rear Admiral. He stepped back and saluted me, holding the salute with the formality reserved for flag officers. I returned the salute, my hand steady, my vision blurring slightly at the edges. "Congratulations, Admiral Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "The fleet is proud of you." The room erupted. Not just applause this time, something more, a release, a celebration. 200 officers on their feet, many of them cheering openly, protocol momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine emotion. The young female lieutenant I had noticed earlier was crying, her hand pressed to her mouth. A grizzled captain near the back was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. And my family was finally understanding. The lies they had believed for 15 years were crumbling around them. The pathetic failure Victoria had invented, the clerical worker on the forgotten ship, the daughter who begged for money and embarrassed the Mitchell name, that woman did not exist. The woman standing at this podium, wearing the star of a Rear Admiral with a Distinguished Service Medal newly pinned to her chest, was real. And she was me. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. I stood at the podium, letting it wash over me like a tide, allowing myself to feel the full weight of this moment. 24 years of service, 24 years of sacrifice, 24 years of choosing duty over comfort, purpose over approval, the family I built over the family that rejected me. Every decision I had ever made had led to this podium. Every sleepless night aboard a ship rolling through storm-tossed seas. Every letter home that went unanswered. Every holiday spent far from land, surrounded by sailors who had become my brothers and sisters in ways blood never could. All of it had been building toward this single, crystalline moment of recognition. The room finally began to quiet. Officers lowered themselves back into their seats. Civilians dabbed at their eyes with cocktail napkins. The energy in the ballroom had shifted from celebration to anticipation. They wanted to hear from me now. They wanted to know the woman behind the medals. I gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingers. My speech was prepared, printed on cards tucked into my jacket pocket, but I had memorized every word weeks ago. I didn't need the cards. I needed only to speak from the heart. Before I began, I allowed myself one glance toward the back of the room. Victoria was still seated, though everyone around her had only just stopped standing. Her face had transformed into something I had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, not the cold superiority she wore like armor. This was fear, raw, undisguised fear. The fear of a woman who had just realized her entire carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. My father sat beside her, his face a mask of bewildered shock. His mouth moved slightly, forming words that produced no sound. He looked like a man who had just been told the sky was green and grass was blue. struggling to reconcile reality with everything he thought he knew. Derek had given up on his phone entirely. It sat forgotten on the table while he stared at me with an expression that mixed horror with something almost like awe. The smug investment banker who had mocked my borrowed medals an hour ago was confronting the possibility that he had been wrong about everything, that the stepsister he had dismissed as a failure his entire life was standing at a podium reserved for the Navy's most distinguished officers. Melissa had buried her face in her husband's shoulder. I couldn't tell if she was crying or simply hiding, perhaps both. And Uncle Frank, my dear Uncle Frank, was still standing, even though everyone else had sat down. His salute had ended, but his eyes had not left my face. Tears streamed freely down his weathered cheeks, and he made no move to wipe them away. He was proud. Genuinely, openly, overwhelmingly proud. I turned my attention back to the room at large and began to speak. Thank you, Admiral Brennan, for that extraordinary introduction. And thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. Your presence honors me more than I can express. My voice was steady. My hands were still. 24 years of command had taught me how to project calm even when storms raged inside. When I enlisted in the Navy at 19 years old, I did so against the wishes of nearly everyone who claimed to know what was best for me. I was told that military service was beneath my family's station. I was told I was making a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that I would fail. I paused, letting the silence stretch. For a long time, I wondered if they were right. The early years were hard. Boot camp was designed to break you down before building you back up, and there were moments when I questioned whether I had the strength to survive it. Officer candidate school was harder. My first deployment was harder still. There were nights when I stood on the deck of my ship, surrounded by nothing but dark water and distant stars, and wondered if anyone back home even remembered I existed. In the back of the room, I saw Victoria whisper something urgently to my father. He didn't respond. He was too busy staring at me, his expression slowly shifting from shock to something else, something I couldn't quite identify. But here is what I learned in those years, on those ships, under that endless sky. I learned that family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by choice, by presence, by the people who show up when showing up is difficult, who believe in you when belief requires faith, who stand beside you when standing alone would be easier. I looked directly at Uncle Frank. His tears had not stopped, but he was smiling now, a trembling smile that spoke of years of quiet support finally acknowledged. Chief Petty Officer Francis Mitchell, retired, my uncle, the only member of my biological family who never stopped believing in me, even when evidence was deliberately hidden from him. Uncle Frank, would you please stand? He was already standing, but the room didn't know that. The spotlight operator swung the secondary light toward his table, illuminating him in a warm glow. The audience turned to look at this elderly man in his civilian suit, standing with military bearing that 20 years of retirement had not erased. Uncle Frank served 20 years in the Navy before I was born. He taught me what honor looked like long before I wore a uniform. He is the reason I know that service runs deeper than rank, deeper than recognition, deeper than any medal they could pin on my chest. Thank you, Uncle Frank, for everything. The room applauded. Uncle Frank nodded, his hand pressed against his heart, and finally lowered himself back into his seat. Victoria stared at him with undisguised fury, as though his acknowledgement was somehow a betrayal of the family narrative she had worked so hard to maintain. I continued speaking, shifting into the portion of my remarks that addressed the sailors I had commanded, the missions we had undertaken together, the meaning of service in an uncertain world. I spoke about the humanitarian operations in the South Pacific, about the 3,000 civilians we had evacuated from rising floodwaters and civil chaos. I spoke about the young enlisted sailors who had worked around the clock, the helicopter pilots who had flown impossible missions, the medical teams who had treated injuries with supplies that were never quite enough. The true measure of service, I said, is not the recognition we receive. It is the lives we touch when no one is watching. It is the difference we make in moments that will never appear in any official report. Every sailor in this room knows what I'm talking about. Every officer who has held a command knows the weight of decisions made in darkness, with imperfect information, when lives hang in the balance. The room was utterly silent. Even the serving staff had stopped moving, trays frozen in mid-transport, captivated by the words filling the ballroom. I have been extraordinarily fortunate in my career. I have served under brilliant commanders and alongside dedicated shipmates. I have witnessed acts of courage that would bring tears to your eyes and acts of compassion that restored my faith in humanity. The Navy did not just give me a career. It gave me a family. It gave me a purpose. It gave me a reason to become the person I was always meant to be. I paused, gathering myself for what came next. We cannot control how others see us. We can only control who we become. As I spoke these words, I looked directly at Victoria. Her face had drained of all color. She understood that this line was meant for her. She understood that I knew about the letters, the lies, the systematic campaign to erase my existence from my father's awareness. I held her gaze for a long moment, watching her struggle to maintain composure while her world crumbled around her. Then I continued. To the young officers in this room, I want you to know something. Your career will not be defined by those who doubt you. It will be defined by your response to that doubt. Every obstacle is an opportunity. Every setback is a chance to prove your resilience. And every person who tells you that you cannot succeed is simply someone who lacks the vision to see what you will become. I felt the energy in the room shift. The young lieutenant who had been crying earlier was nodding vigorously, her eyes bright with determination. Other junior officers leaned forward in their seats, absorbing every word. To those who underestimated me, I said, my voice growing quieter but somehow carrying even further. To those who tried to diminish me, who hid my achievements from those I loved, who spent years convinced that their narrative would become reality simply because they repeated it often enough, I want you to know something. The silence was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. She spent 15 years hiding my letters. She couldn't hide who I became. The words hung in the air like a verdict. I did not look at Victoria again. I didn't need to. I could feel her reaction from across the room, the sharp intake of breath, the trembling hands, the dawning horror of complete and utter exposure. Everyone in that ballroom now understood that there was a story behind the story. Everyone understood that tonight's ceremony was about more than military achievement. It was about truth finally defeating lies. I concluded my remarks with the traditional thanks to the Secretary of the Navy, to Admiral Brennan, to the staff of the Naval War College who had organized the ceremony. I spoke of my excitement for the challenges ahead, for the responsibilities that came with flag rank, for the opportunity to mentor the next generation of naval leaders. And then I stepped back from the podium. The applause that followed was different from before. It was more sustained, more emotional, more personal. Officers who had never met me were on their feet. Civilians who had come expecting a routine ceremony were wiping their eyes. The young lieutenant was openly sobbing now, supported by the officer beside her. Admiral Brennan returned to the podium and shook my hand once more, leaning in to speak words meant only for me. That was extraordinary, Admiral. You said exactly what needed to be said. Thank you, sir. I meant every word. I know you did. He squeezed my hand. Your mother would be proud. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He knew. Of course he knew. Admiral Brennan made it his business to know everything about the officers under his command, especially those he was grooming for flag rank. He had read my file. He understood the absence in my life, and he had just acknowledged it in the most respectful way possible. Yes, sir, I managed. I believe she would. He released my hand and turned back to the audience to conclude the formal ceremony. There would be photographs, congratulations, a reception with champagne and small talk. The evening was far from over. But for me, the most important part had already happened. I had stood at that podium and told my truth. I had acknowledged Uncle Frank's support, and by implication, exposed the lack of support from everyone else. I had looked directly at the woman who had tried to erase me and let her see that she had failed. The rest was just aftermath. The formal ceremony concluded with Admiral Brennan inviting guests to enjoy the reception. Waiters materialized from the edges of the room carrying trays of champagne. A string quartet in the corner began playing something soft and elegant. The rigid formality of the ceremony dissolved into the warm buzz of celebration. I stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by fellow officers. Handshakes, congratulations, embraces from colleagues who had served beside me through deployments and difficult decisions. Captain Harrison clapped me on the shoulder and told me I had made him proud. Commander Diaz, my former executive officer, wiped her eyes and said she had known this day would come since the first time she watched me command a ship through rough seas. I accepted each gesture of recognition with genuine gratitude, but part of my attention remained fixed on the table at the back of the room. Through the crowd, I caught glimpses of chaos unfolding. Victoria had risen from her seat. Her carefully maintained composure had shattered completely. Even from this distance, I could see that her hands were shaking as she grabbed my father's arm, her mouth moving rapidly. She was speaking to him with an intensity that bordered on desperation, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes remained fixed on me, following my movements through the crowd with an expression I had never seen him wear before. It looked almost like grief. Derek had finally picked up his phone again, but he wasn't taking photos now. He was frantically scrolling, deleting, his face flushed with embarrassment. The picture he had taken earlier, the one he had planned to share with his group chat as evidence of his pathetic stepsister playing dress-up, had become a liability. A rear admiral in the United States Navy. The youngest woman to achieve flag rank in the Pacific Fleet. Not exactly the punchline he had been planning. Melissa remained seated, her face buried in her hands while her husband attempted to comfort her. I wondered what she was thinking, whether she was embarrassed by her own behavior or simply mortified that she had been caught. There was a difference, and I suspected I knew which one applied. A Navy photographer approached me with a request for official portraits. I posed beside Admiral Brennan, beside the Secretary of the Navy's representative, beside the Naval War College commandant. Each flash of the camera captured a moment of triumph, a record of achievement that no one could erase or intercept or throw in the trash. These photographs would be published. They would appear in Navy Times, in the official records, in the permanent documentation of my career. Victoria couldn't hide them. Not anymore. Not ever again. Between photographs, I noticed my father attempting to stand. Victoria grabbed his arm and pulled him back down, hissing something that made his face crumple. But he shook her off, more forcefully than I had ever seen him reject her before, and pushed himself to his feet. A protocol officer stepped into his path before he could take more than 2 steps toward the stage. "Sir, the Admiral is engaged with official duties at the moment. If you'd like to offer your congratulations, there will be an opportunity during the reception." My father's mouth opened and closed, but I'm her father. The protocol officer's expression didn't change. "Of course, sir. The Admiral will be available shortly." I watched this exchange from across the room, feeling something twist in my chest. He was her father. The words echoed in my mind with a hollow ring. He had been my father for 42 years, but I couldn't remember the last time he had acted like it. The last time he had defended me. The last time he had chosen me over Victoria's convenience. And now, here he was, trying to reach me, and protocol was standing in his way. The irony was not lost on me. Victoria had risen again. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands and attempted to compose her features into something resembling dignity. But the damage was done. The guests at neighboring tables had witnessed her reaction to my promotion. They had seen the champagne glass slip from her fingers. They had watched her whispered arguments with my father, her frantic attempts to control a narrative that had spun completely beyond her grasp. Whispers were spreading through the civilian guests like ripples in a pond. I couldn't hear the words, but I could guess their content. "Did you see her stepmother's face? She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Apparently the family thought she was some kind of failure. Can you imagine? A rear admiral, and they didn't even know." Victoria's social reputation, the thing she valued above almost everything else, was crumbling in real time. She must have felt the stares, because she suddenly grabbed her clutch and headed for the exit. But she had miscalculated. The ballroom's main doors were near the stage, which meant she had to walk through the crowd of naval officers offering me their congratulations. Every step brought her closer to the epicenter of her humiliation. I watched her approach, this woman who had spent 15 years systematically destroying my relationship with my father. She walked with her chin held high, affecting an air of nonchalance that fooled no one. Her eyes were too bright. Her steps were too quick. She was fleeing, and everyone could see it. Our eyes met when she was perhaps 10 feet away. She stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. The officers around me noticed the shift in my attention and followed my gaze. A small circle of silence formed in the midst of the celebration. Victoria's lips trembled. She seemed to be searching for something to say, some way to reclaim control of a situation that had utterly escaped her. "This is," she started, her voice cracking. "This is some kind of mistake. She couldn't possibly. She was nothing." The words came out louder than she intended. Several heads turned. An admiral I didn't recognize raised an eyebrow. Commander Diaz stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of me in a gesture of protection that I found deeply touching. "Ma'am, I served under Admiral Mitchell for 3 years. I can assure you there is no mistake." Victoria's face contorted. "You don't understand. She's my stepdaughter. She answers phones on a supply ship. She begs for money. She's a complete and utter." "That's enough." My father's voice cut through her tirade. He had somehow made it through the crowd and now stood a few feet behind Victoria, his face pale but determined. Victoria spun to face him. "Richard, don't you dare." I said that's enough. His voice was stronger now, carrying an authority I hadn't heard from him in decades. "Look around you, Victoria. Look at this room. Look at the star on her collar. Whatever you told me, whatever story you invented, it was a lie, all of it." "I was protecting you," Victoria hissed. "I was protecting this family from her constant begging, her failures, her." "She never begged." My father's voice broke on the words. "She never asked for a single thing, did she? Not once in 24 years. I would have remembered, I would have." He trailed off, the realization settling over him like a physical weight. The letters he never saw. The photographs that never arrived. The daughter who seemed to have simply vanished from his life, replaced by Victoria's carefully crafted fiction. Derek had materialized beside his mother, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. "Mom, we should go. People are staring." "Let them stare." Victoria's voice had gone shrill. "This whole thing is obviously some kind of fraud. The Navy doesn't just promote people to admiral. There must be an explanation, a mistake in the paperwork, something." "Victoria," Admiral Brennan's voice cut through her denial like a knife. I hadn't noticed him approach, but he now stood beside me, his expression polite but cold. "I personally recommended Admiral Mitchell for this promotion. I have served alongside her for 12 years. There is no mistake. There is no fraud. There is only an exceptional officer receiving the recognition she has earned through decades of exemplary service." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you have further concerns, I suggest you take them up with the Secretary of the Navy, though I suspect you'll find that conversation rather short." Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to say. I stepped forward, moving past Commander Diaz's protective stance. The crowd parted to let me through. I stopped directly in front of my stepmother, close enough to see the mascara beginning to smear beneath her eyes. "Victoria," I said quietly, my voice pitched for her ears alone. "You spent 15 years trying to erase me, hiding my letters, poisoning my father against me, telling everyone who would listen that I was a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale." She flinched as if I had struck her. "But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. It doesn't matter how many letters you burned or how many lies you told. The truth was always there, waiting, and now everyone in this room knows it." I leaned slightly closer. "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to demand an apology that we both know would be meaningless. I'm simply going to walk back to that stage, and accept congratulations from people who actually value my accomplishments. And you're going to leave, because we both know that staying here is going to be unbearable for you." Victoria's face crumpled. For one brief moment, I saw behind the mask she wore, saw the insecurity and jealousy that had driven her to such cruelty. She had been so threatened by an 18-year-old girl's relationship with her father that she had spent 15 years systematically destroying it. And in the end, it hadn't mattered at all. I turned away from her without waiting for a response. Admiral Brennan offered me his arm, a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words, and escorted me back toward the stage where more photographs awaited. Behind me, I heard Derek urgently whispering to his mother. I heard Melissa finally emerge from her husband's shoulder, asking in a stunned voice what they should do now. I heard my father call my name, his voice cracking with emotion. I did not turn around. Not yet. There would be time for that conversation later, or perhaps there wouldn't be. That was his choice to make now, not mine. I had spent 24 years proving myself. I was done seeking approval from people who had never offered it. The reception continued for another hour. I moved through it like a ship through familiar waters, accepting congratulations, posing for photographs, exchanging words with colleagues and dignitaries who wanted to express their admiration. The young lieutenant who had been crying found me near the champagne table and thanked me with trembling sincerity for showing her what was possible. A grizzled master chief who had served under my command a decade ago appeared out of nowhere to shake my hand and tell me he had always known I was destined for great things. These moments filled me with warmth. These people, my Navy family, had witnessed my journey in ways my biological family never had. They had seen me grow from an uncertain ensign into a confident commander. They had watched me make difficult decisions and stand by those decisions when the consequences arrived. They knew who I was because they had been there. Victoria, Derek, and Melissa had slipped away sometime during the reception. I noticed their empty seats at the back table, the abandoned champagne glasses, the programs left behind on the white tablecloth. They had fled rather than face the continued stares and whispers. I felt no satisfaction at their departure, only a quiet sense of closure. My father had not left with them. I was aware of him throughout the reception, hovering at the edges of conversations, watching me with those grief-stricken eyes. Several times he approached, only to be intercepted by well-meaning officers who wanted to introduce themselves or by protocol staff who gently redirected him. Each time, I saw his shoulders slump a little more. Part of me wanted to put him out of his misery. Part of me wanted to walk over and tell him it was fine, that we could start fresh, that the past was behind us. That part was the 18-year-old girl who had lost her mother and desperately wanted her father to fill that void. But I was not 18 anymore. I was a rear admiral in the United States Navy. I had learned that some voids cannot be filled by people who helped create them. The reception began to wind down. Guests filtered toward the exits, offering final congratulations as they passed. Admiral Brennan found me one last time to confirm our meeting scheduled for the following week, when we would discuss my new assignment in detail. Commander Diaz hugged me fiercely and made me promise to keep in touch. Finally, the ballroom was nearly empty. The string quartet had packed up their instruments. The waiters were collecting empty glasses and folded napkins. The crystal chandeliers still blazed overhead, but the magic of the evening was fading into memory. I stood near the grand doorway, preparing to leave, when my father appeared in front of me. He looked older than I had ever seen him. The lines on his face seemed deeper, carved by the weight of what he had learned tonight. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Sarah," his voice was hoarse, "please, can we talk?" I studied him for a long moment. This man who had been my hero when I was a child. This man who had read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bicycle and held me when I cried over scraped knees. This man who had slowly, inexorably, allowed himself to be separated from me by a woman he chose over his own daughter. "What would you like to say?" My voice was calm, not cold but not warm either, neutral, the voice I used in difficult negotiations. I didn't know. The words tumbled out of him in a rush. Sarah, I swear to you I didn't know. Victoria told me you had washed out of basic training. She said you were embarrassed and didn't want to talk about it. She said you blamed me for your mother's death and that's why you never called. She said a lot of things. I cut him off gently. And you believed all of them. He flinched. Yes, I believed her. I shouldn't have. I should have called you myself. I should have asked questions. I should have. You should have been my father. The words hung between us, simple and devastating. His face crumpled. You're right. I should have been. I failed you, Sarah. I failed you in every way a father can fail a child. And I don't know how to make that right. I don't know if I can make that right. I considered his words carefully. I thought about all the letters I had written, all the photographs I had sent, all the holidays I had spent alone because there was no place for me at his table. I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had desperately wanted her father's approval and the woman who had learned to live without it. You chose not to know, Dad. My voice remained steady. Every letter I sent, every commendation, every promotion. You chose her version because it was easier, because questioning her would have meant conflict, and you have always hated conflict more than anything else. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He knew I was right. Please, he whispered. Can we at least try? Can we start over? I thought about that question for a long moment. Starting over. As if 24 years could be erased, as if the wounds could simply heal because we wished them to. As if trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt with nothing more than good intentions. The Navy taught me something important, I said finally. Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. You have no drops left, Dad. You spent them all, one by one, every time you chose her over me. Every time you accepted her lies without question. Every time you let another year pass without picking up the phone. Tears were streaming down his face now. He made no move to wipe them away. I'm not saying never, I continued, my voice softening slightly. I'm saying not tonight, not like this. If you want to rebuild something with me, it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. And it's going to require you to take a long, hard look at the choices you made and the man you became. He nodded, unable to speak. I have to go now. I have responsibilities waiting. A new command to prepare for. A life that doesn't include you because you chose not to be part of it. I stepped past him, toward the grand doorway. Then I paused and looked back over my shoulder. But Dad, if you're serious about trying, you know how to reach me. My address hasn't changed in 15 years. Neither has my phone number. The only thing that changed was whether the messages got through. I left him standing there, tears on his face, surrounded by empty tables and the ghosts of all the years we had lost. The night air was cool and clean as I stepped outside. Rhode Island in autumn, with stars scattered across a velvet sky. An aide waited beside my official vehicle, the door already open. Before I climbed in, I paused. I reached beneath my uniform and withdrew my mother's locket, the one I had worn against my skin through every deployment, every command, every moment when I needed to remember why I was fighting. I opened it and looked at the tiny photograph inside. My mother's face, young and beautiful and full of life. Beside her, a 7-year-old version of me, gap-toothed and grinning. We did it, Mom, I whispered. Everything you believed I could be, everything you hoped for me, we did it. I kissed the locket gently, then tucked it back beneath my uniform, close to my heart where it belonged. The aide helped me into the vehicle. As we pulled away from the Naval War College, I watched the grand building recede in the rearview mirror. Somewhere inside, my father was still standing where I had left him, confronting the wreckage of his choices. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter than that, something more like peace. The stars on my shoulders weren't just symbols of rank. They were monuments to every letter Victoria had burned, every lie she had told, every time my father had chosen silence over truth. I didn't wear them for revenge. I wore them because I had earned them through sacrifice, dedication, and a refusal to let other people's limitations define my potential. Victoria had spent 15 years trying to hide who I was. She couldn't hide who I became. And as the car carried me into the Rhode Island night, toward a future bright with possibility and purpose, I realized that was the only truth that had ever mattered.